Certainly yield.
Does the gentleman yield?
Yields for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Murr. Just wanted to run through a few questions and really kind of follow up on what Representative Walla was discussing with respect to voters in Harris County who had used the drive-through vote centers during the 2020 election. Do you recall that the Harris County Election Administrator testified before the committee during a hearing on SB 7 and HB 6 that approximately 53% of the votes cast at the 10 drive-through sites available during the 2020 election were by people of color? Are you familiar with that data point?
I was not present during the testimony during the regular session of the committee hearing, so I will defer to you in assuming that that data point as you describe it is accurate.
Yeah, of the 127,000 voters, Republicans and Democrats, who cast ballots via the drive-through centers in the 2020 general election, keeping in mind that we were in the middle of the deadliest pandemic of 100 years, or in 100 years, 53% were voters of color, so it's approximately 67,310 people. Why is that method of voting, why does that increase the likelihood of fraud in your view? Or does it increase the likelihood of fraud in your view?
In order to answer your question, I'll point to some of the testimony that we heard from witnesses during both the first called and the second called sessions, committee hearings, talking about the fact, and you heard us earlier talk about the sanctity of our ability to go into a private space in the voting or polling location and cast our ballot in private. Once you remove yourself from that polling location and now you are in a more public area, for example, in an automobile, perhaps surrounded by other people, your ability to cast your ballot in private is not as easy to do.
How many voters complained that they were concerned about the secrecy of their ballot when using this process?
I believe that I don't have a number in front of me, but we did hear some witness testimony that exhibited some concerns about that process.
From the voters themselves?
I don't know. I don't know if they were voters that tried to use that process or not.
In other words, did the voters ever complain about their secrecy being infringed upon, or were there third parties that said, well, this is a concern?
I am not advised.
Okay. But you referred to the testimony both during the first regular session that you admittedly said you were not, that you did not sit in on, and also the special session. Is that right?
The regular session I did not participate in. The first called and the second called sessions, committee hearing testimony, yes, I did participate in.
Why would we be punishing local elected officials during the deadliest pandemic in 100 years for using these drive-through vote centers? Why would we be punishing them with penalty enhancements?
I do not view it as a punishment. I do believe that efforts were made, perhaps with good intentions, to skillfully and artfully interpret the election code to try to arrive at methods that they could then apply during a pandemic scenario. I understand that.
And you believe it was in good faith to sort of mitigate the spread of a deadly virus?
I have never encouraged that it was in bad faith.
Okay. So back to my original question, how does that increase the likelihood of fraud, which was the language that you used, and I think the language in the bill?
And as I just mentioned to you, the moment that you have the activity of voting occurring outside the polling location, which, as you well know, the election code spends a great deal of language providing the safety, security, and privacy that we all yearn for when we're making our decisions, that becomes more of an open process if you're out in a
But you're unaware of any instances, as you just testified, where either secrecy was adversely affected, where a voter said they were worried about the secrecy of their ballot, or cases of fraud specifically with this method of voting?
Mr. Anchia, I'm just not advised.
But you're unaware?
I'm unaware at this time, yeah.
Okay. And so penalty enhancements are usually designed to achieve a deterrent effect. What are we trying to deter here, other than, as you said, local elected officials in the middle of a deadly pandemic trying to facilitate exercise of the franchise while at the same time keeping people safe? What are we trying to deter by penalty enhancements?
By penalty enhancements, okay, you have two parts there. The steps that they took during the pandemic, for example, were not steps that were taken statewide in various different jurisdictions. We'll call them counties. And so that's one part of your question there. And I go back to the concept of uniformity and consistency across the state. So you, as a voter, you prefer to see some standardized or equal treatment of the voting process across those jurisdictional lines, and that's up to a policy decision by the state to do.
Are
and then separately, you're talking
254
about
counties
penalties.
equal? Are they made equally, geographically, population-wise?
I've never said that they were all equal.
Okay.
So I'm not going to say that Dallas County and Harris County and the rural counties out west are all equal. I understand that
But you feel
concept.
that a sparsely populated county that may have 100 people, or 200 or 300 people,
Loving County has 62, I think.
should be treated the same as a county with 3 million people.
They should have an expectation of uniformity in the application of the election code.
And how does that further how does that equal treatment of different circumstances, especially during a pandemic, further the policy goal of reducing the likelihood of fraud?
You ask a broad question. I'll go back to consistent application and uniform application of our election code.
How does that uniformity and that, because you're making a policy choice here, you're saying, hey, uniformity is important, despite the fact that we know that counties are completely different. Uniformity is important, and we want to impose that uniformity despite the difference in counties. How does that achieve the policy end, which you've articulated that is the goal of the bill, in reducing the likelihood of fraud?
And reducing the likelihood of fraud is not the only policy goal that's articulated in the bill. And I know that you're focused on that.
How about that one specifically?
So I understand that, but I'm also going to remind you that it also contains language regarding the protection of the secrecy of the ballot and promoting voter access to ensure that all legally cast ballots are counted. So when we talk about...
How does it promote voter access?
Well, when we talk about voting from vehicles, I think a lot of effort and focus is given to protecting the secrecy of the ballot, which was what I was speaking to earlier.
But you also said that there were no instances that you were aware of a voter who said that the secrecy of their ballot was somehow impacted by this mode of voting, right? You said there may have been third parties who suggested that, but never a voter who complained to you or to the committee.
I didn't say one way or another. I'm just not aware of that information.
Okay, so you're unaware. So how does banning this during a terrible pandemic further either the likelihood of fraud goal, the access to the ballot goal, or the secrecy of the ballot goal?
So you go and you say ban. This is an emphasis on what was understood to be current law more prior to the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, everybody's expectation was the ability to vote curbside from your automobile under current law, which is also protected by federal law. That was expounded upon by interpretations of one or more local jurisdictions. This simply comes back and explains that that's not how election code has operated in the state of Texas.
And where was that interpretation that this activity was prohibited? Where is that interpretation? Where's that found?
Because the only place in the election code that I'm aware of that speaks to the ability to vote from your motor vehicle expressly is section 64.009, and that has to do with what we refer to as our curbside voting, and it actually has a reason that you have to exhibit for that. It's not universal in nature.
So back to my original question, the three precepts, I guess, or the policy goals that you're trying to achieve in this bill are secrecy, are reducing what you said, the likelihood of fraud, or access to the ballot. How does this policy decision that you're making further those goals?
Okay, I'll just be clear, because I've tried to answer your questions. Can you hone in specifically? What are we visiting about?
I apologize. What Harris County did with respect to these drive-through voting modes that you are seeking to prohibit the use of on a go-forward basis.
Yes, and so I will articulate. Let me generically refer to that concept as universal voting from your vehicle for purposes of that, or universal curbside voting. And that's
or
what
at least, at the very least, we could narrow it and say during a pandemic, right?
Well, we'll just call it
when it was used. Universal
curbside voting, and I believe that we heard testimony, and I articulate to you today that it protects the secrecy of the ballot to say that, you know, we're not here to let every person vote from your car when you're perfectly able to go into a secure polling location and vote in the framework that we set up for a secure ballot. we provide the voter access for the folks who have trouble actually leaving their car. So we currently have that framework. And then if you're going to have folks that utilize some type of universal curbside voting, the ability to know whether or not that is subject to abuse, I don't know. We didn't hear a lot of testimony on that.
Is that secrecy of concern with respect to drive-through voting that is currently permitted under the law?
We didn't hear, I wasn't aware, and I didn't hear witness testimony speak directly to that. Typically, it was more on the topic of the universal curbside voting that you have mentioned in your questioning.
So you're unaware of any voters who are concerned about the secrecy of their ballot in the Harris County model, what you might call universal, and you haven't heard any concerns about secrecy with respect to traditional drive-through voting. Is that a fair statement?
I'm just not advised, so that's a fair statement.
Okay, super. You talked about the how Texas has been a leader in access to the franchise in the past. At the beginning of your layout, can you recount the different things that we have in Texas law and the dates when they were adopted?
And this is just a snapshot, so please don't think this is all inclusive.
I'll stipulate that it's a non-exhaustive list.
Thank you. In 1975, Texas passed mail-in voter registration.
What was the year?
1975.
Okay.
In 1987, Texas implemented early voting. And that's what we talk about. 1987. That's what we talk about when we speak of the 2 weeks of early voting that we are accustomed to, along with the weekend of early voting.
Okay.
Prior to that, it was just election day.
Okay.
In 1991, Texas passed what it was referred to as a motor voter law, requiring that voter registration be offered at what we now call DMV locations. And in 1997, Texas ensured that voting machines be accessible to voters with disabilities.
Disabilities.
Yes, sir. Okay. And those are just examples, but they're certainly not an exhaustive list.
And they're laudable examples of expanding access to the franchise, right?
Pointing to efforts by this body made for the benefit of the voters of the state of Texas.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.